Martin Klein, and I have the honor and privilege to chair this panel today. We have a all-star lineup of 3 panelists assembled here today. We have Meghan Lyon. Meghan is a digital collection specialist at the Library of Congress in the US, who will start us off. Then we have Tom Storrar, who is the head of web archiving at the National Archives in the UK. And last but certainly not least, Calum, who is the Q&A team lead at MirrorWeb, also located in the UK. And just very, very briefly, 2 comments, right? When we talked about archivability, the question of can we archive this, right? Can we capture this? Often you hear these responses of, I don't know, maybe, let's try, we'll see how this goes, right? So I have this notion of, we probably are pretty good in archiving the web of the 1990s and maybe the early 2000s, but more recently so, maybe that's more difficult. This famous quote from Michael Nelson at Old Dominion University, who said, JavaScript is why we can't have nice things. Then you have the counter-argument by saying, well, more and more websites are created by means of content management systems. They're all basically the same, right? There's patterns that are repeating. So maybe if we do better in designing and developing tools that can deal with those patterns, maybe we actually can do a better job down the road, right? So maybe that's a bit of a back and forth that we're trying to discuss here today. And so without further ado, I think I'll hand it over to Meghan, who will start us off.
Hi, thank you so much for that introduction. So yeah, my name's Meghan Lyon. I'm a digital collection specialist at on the web archiving section at the Library of Congress. And can we capture this? So I'll talk a little bit about what our section's challenges are and kind of what inspired work that last year we commissioned MirrorWeb to do in their expert services research on archivability. Next slide, please. Oh, awesome. So at the library, our section of 7 plus 1 supervisor facilitates the library's web archiving program. We have a lot of relationships in communicating web archiving standards and practices and challenges to the non-web archiving stakeholders who are represented by any bubble that's not like a reddish orange there. That's a really big part of our job, and that communication involves sharing our knowledge on how content is archived, what it should look like when it's rendered, how it should work, and also how it's preserved. And so this diagram illustrates groups that we communicate, what roles those groups play in specific areas of work, and they include other departments at the library and our vendor. Next up. Our section is in the middle of everything web archiving, but we don't select the content, we don't make selection policy, we don't harvest, and we don't build the infrastructure. We kind of facilitate the program. We set requirements for our colleagues in OCIO or IT who build and maintain the transfer, replay, and storage environments. We train librarians who are the recommending officers selecting the collections, and we provide them with training and documentation on everything from like what is web archiving at all to how to use web archives to how to use some internal tools and how to describe web archives on loc.gov. And then we also translate the nominations that come in from those recommending officers in the form of preparing seeds and scopes for crawling that we send to MirrorWeb to run the large-scale contract crawls. And we work collaboratively with MirrorWeb on quality assurance. And then we shepherd the collections materials through the many transfer and storage pipelines so that eventually they're preserved and then presented on loc.gov. And so the archive of the concept of archivability plays into all those things. The more we know about archivability on the live web, the better we can translate, do these duties, inform and train others. And we'll do the next slide. So we are the vectors of communication. The web archiving staff are the vectors of communication, and I made this really big and bold because that's like our whole job. And occasionally, so we communicate to MirrorWeb, our nominating staff, management, and also occasionally the public, who are the creators of the websites that we then archive. And we try to the best of our ability to smooth out the communication to manage this large program. The selective harvesting program is taking in about 700 terabytes of novel content annually. We average over 15,000 distinct seeds crawling at any time and crawl continuously, weekly, monthly, and quarterly. These are our single copy numbers from 2024, 4.4 petabytes of works, and then about 12.5 terabytes of indexes. Next. So on top of keeping that program running, we try to do as much quality assurance as possible, and we've talked here and on several occasions at the IIPC Web Archiving Conference 2022 and 2023. And so we try to keep on top of quality assurance issues at scale, but even using data-driven methods to identify problems, sometimes there's nothing we can really do to remedy them after we find them with a visual check. But we want to work towards proactive quality assurance, and kind of we're hoping that like having a discussion with everyone about archivability will get us there. Next slide. So it's no accident that we use the word nominate to describe the selection of live web materials for the permanent collections. It's not really well known that we can't necessarily archive everything. And I think that to most users of the web archive, of the websites, the web is really opaque. And I think that what is good design appears to be really simple on the outside can actually be really complex on the back end. And so, as we all know, there's lots of interacting technologies that are centering user interaction to make live sites work. And there's tracking, dynamic image resizing, there's data visualizations, there's databases, there's content that loads when a user scrolls, and so there's like a lot of stuff. And then we find a lot of unexpected things when we look under the hood, and it can be really scary for web archivists when we take a closer look at the live web, even just with browser developer tools. And so we've tried to get ahead of that problem. The library has described some of this difficult to capture behavior in our Creating Preservable Websites guidance for site owners. And those site owners are sometimes the developers, but oftentimes they're kind of the intellectual owners of the website, like a company. And it's not a requirement at all for anybody to adhere to any web standards, let alone our archivability standards. And it's, the guidelines are kind of suggestions for site owners to follow if they want their nominated content to be well preserved. And then another source of non-archivability, other than the code directly making up the website, is security. And as far as I understand, good bots and bad bots aren't really sorted through robots.txt exclusion, which is the only reference to security that we have on the Creating Preservable guidelines. It's kind of more like machine learning algorithms and bot detection that's automated, sometimes non-automated. You get like a CAPTCHA challenge from like an actual administrator who says, you're not real. So then what can we do with this guidance to improve it so that we can give people who are website creators advice to make their site archivable, but also have it be secure? And so then looking at this from another angle, the web archiving section provides challenges, known challenges for our internal staff. We've been asked over the last few years to share this known challenges page, but it changes really rapidly. It's really kind of about our program alone, but it's going to be in the UNT repository, so you can look at it if you want. It's not really indicative of like other web archiving programs, and they're not really generalizable challenges, but might be interesting. And with that, what's in that guidance is just our advice to recommending officers to not add social media services to the crawl, streaming, anything, like that, don't add it to the crawl, and to expect replay issues of older content from past periods when we were capturing things like social media and YouTube and whatnot. We also have a boilerplate for site owners who ask us to point to guidelines, but we rarely get that question via email. And next slide, please. So how do we improve guidance to staff, to the public, and also keep ourselves informed? Like what, at what point and with what information do we update the guidelines? And is anybody reading them? Last year, we asked MirrorWeb to conduct expert service research on the landscape that I've described, like what's happening in web development that has a direct impact on the quality of the archives. Is it just us at the library experiencing problems, or is everybody seeing the same challenges? How do we manage expectations from site owners, of the site owners and the nominators? And how do we flag incoming nominations for issues ourselves? Do we need a complete paradigm shift about what web archiving is, or are there maybe some practical steps that we can take to maintain a program like this at scale? And so we didn't ask them to solve every single one of those problems, but we asked them to conduct a survey, research some of the sticking points, define archivability, and help us find a way forward to do some proactive quality assurance. Anything we can do at the outset of nomination to predict capture problems before we expend all of our human and technical resources. And that's it. Thank you.
Of course, I forgot to mention that this is going to be the format. So we'll have three presentations, 10 minutes each-ish in this context. And so I'd like to ask you to hold your questions, please, until the end. Then we have a vivid discussion section afterwards, right? So I'll hand it over to Tom as soon as I can pull your slides up.
Yeah, hi everyone. I'm Tom Storrar. I'm head of web archiving at the National Archives. Next slide, please. So the UK Government Web Archive. We sit in the National Archives of the UK, and we play a role as part of the wider archive in that we preserve government records, and Government Online has been selected as basically a government record for permanent preservation and access. And this is under the Public Records Act in the UK, which allows us to harvest the content and to provide public access to that content as well. We work with MirrorWeb to provide most of the crawling capability we have, and all of the hosting and resource discovery capability as well. The team that we have at National Archives is 7 of us. The number of sites that we deal with are comparatively small compared to a lot of, probably almost all national libraries and those sorts of institutions. We're talking about just under 1,000 websites that we call quite regularly. But because they've been selected as a permanent record of Government Online, the sort of quality levels that we expect and we're sort of striving towards are fairly high. So this presents lots of challenges. I think around a fifth to a quarter of the websites in our collection are problematic one way or another. And I've not actually sort of analysed the scale of the problem there, but it's roughly that, I think. Next slide. So this is our model. So yeah, my visuals are no way as nice as Meghan's. Just they're quite retro. But this is basically our operating model. So we do lots of QA. We have lots of different QA approaches and QA tools. We did some talks last year about this. We've become more scalable in our QA approaches. So things like analysing log files and so on. They're not fully automated, so there's still a large manual component that requires people to, basically web archivists, to identify a particular issue in many cases. We're an open access web archive, which is sort of a double-edged sword for us. So it's quite good. We actually learned from our users that stuff doesn't work sometimes, and that kind of adds to our knowledge base of what doesn't work. Obviously, the drawbacks to that are that there's a good chance that it's too late to archive it because it's disappeared from the live web, and also, of course, people expect a digital service just to work. You know, the expectations these days are things to just work. So we do field some complaints on that front. As we're a national archive, we have quite close contact with the producers of the websites themselves, typically government departments, and that means that we can get insight from them, and we can also influence them to a certain extent. But there's this perennial question about who and when do we need to engage with them, and also what, and that's quite a resource intensive thing to do, to actually set up meetings with people to discuss what's wrong with their websites, if we can boil it down that far. That goes into our guidance, which is quite often followed, and it's helped by some sort of frameworks like design manual, which is a centrally held government thing, which provide lots of templates and principles, and also accessibility regulations that are a legal requirement often help with web archiving, but not always. And a lot of the tension that we see is between the core purpose of a body or government department is to publish information or promote a campaign or something like that. That's their primary driver, if you like, and web archiving is often quite far down the list of priorities. Next slide, please. So here's just some examples, really, of the kind of level detail of effort we go to with some of our capturing. So the coronavirus dashboard, top left there, is something that was uncrawlable by any crawler. Basically, it uses a lot of highly interactive material, drop-down boxes, radio buttons, the whole lot. And we were able to basically just construct tens of thousands of seeds for that, and basically just crawl them every day or every week to get a regular snapshots of that dashboard. Massive amount of effort, absolutely customized, and not applicable to any other domain or site. We just, it was like, the pandemic threw up so many of those sort of things. The next one, top right, is the COVID-19 inquiry in the UK. So this is a visualization of some artwork that's been produced for the inquiry, and that's comprised of thousands of tiles, individual little tiles of images that you can make that work if you specify and crawl every single tile. And we did that. Again, not applicable in any other context. And the ONS site is a kind of combination of a reasonably static, but also quite a lot of dynamic content. So we deploy a hybrid crawling approach to archiving that really significant and massive website. That's cool. Next. So some things that sort of Meghan mentioned as well that are a problem to us. So there are all these different levels, really. So there's sort of network level, security level, bot prevention things, captures and services like CloudFront that can block us quite quickly. We've got levels of interactivity that like maps and in-page apps. This is an R-Shiny app, I think, at the bottom there, which are really problematic. We can maybe get a bit of a representation of one view of the data. But this is a good example of where, let's say the Department for Health wants to make a data set available, and we can't really archive it very well. Next slide, please. So this is just my last slide. It's just really to pull it all together, really. I think from our point of view, a lot of the tools have really improved in terms of our ability to capture content, dynamic content, and that's been fantastic. I think where the real bottleneck with time for us is that even with our relatively small collection of sites, is really basically selecting where to focus our effort, and often knowing, figuring out that there's a problem, getting to that point is sort of like the problem, and where is that problem? It's like it's a needle in a haystack situation. So there's a lot of prioritization that goes on, which is largely to do with scale. It's extremely complex. It's not always easy to tell what the problem is, whether it's a capture problem or a replay problem, or anything like that, and it requires a lot of specialist knowledge. And that's it, really.
Thank you. Same thing applies, huh?
Yes.
DJ for you.
Thank you.
Take it away.
Hello, yes, my name's Calum. I am the QA team lead for MirrorWeb. If you're not familiar with MirrorWeb, we are a web archiving service provider. We work with all sorts of organisations in both the preservation sector, like National Archives, Library of Congress, and also the financial compliance sector. My team are responsible for the fidelity of all the websites that we archive, and we work quite closely with Tom's team and with Meghan's team to deliver the quality on those particular captures. So what I'm going to briefly cover today is a community survey that we ran towards the end of last year on the topic of website archivability. We're going to dive a little bit into kind of the definitions that make up the context for that survey, and then kind of explore some of the findings from it. So, next slide, please. So, yes, our community survey. So why did we want to run a community survey? Well, as part of this kind of research project we were doing, we really wanted to get a really reasonable understanding of what guidelines and frameworks the community already had some level of familiarity with. And then we also wanted to explore some of the common challenges that community members might face when it comes to archiving websites. So we got actually a great level of response from the community through our survey from over 37 organisations, primarily from the GLAM sector, mostly librarians and archivists, across a whole range of collection sizes, which was great. And that kind of provides the context for what we're now going to talk about in terms of findings. Next slide. So I just want to start with a few definitions that really set the context for the survey. And the first thing I'm going to start with is archivability itself. I like to define archivability as an assessment of how capable of or suitable for being archived a given website or web page might be, which sounds relatively straightforward. It was quite interesting to see that when we polled the community for kind of some suggested existing guidelines that were available from various organizations, there was a decent level of engagement with these existing frameworks, but 22% of survey respondents weren't familiar with any of the resources that we suggested, or indeed any others at all. So this suggests that there are definitely some gaps in the community's knowledge. To help us kind of really dial down on what issues we might face, I like to really break down the process of web archiving. These two phrases, capture and replay, you may be familiar with already, but if you're not, I like to use capture as a way of describing the process of collecting data, so the way that a web crawler retrieves assets and writes them to WACs, and that's one segment kind of the process of web archiving. And on the flip side of that, you have replay, which is where you reconstruct that data within an interactive web archiving environment that users can really explore and get an experience of that website. And these two definitions are really critical from my perspective, because in order to really get to the bottom of archivability, you have to be able to effectively diagnose an issue. You have to be able to really identify what the core problems are, what the causes of the failures that might be. And only through effective diagnosis can we really improve the quality of communication that we have with people like site owners. So, next slide. So just, dive more into the actual results that we found from the survey. I've got a couple of pie charts up here. So just to start with that question of capture and replay, we provided those definitions to the community and then posed the question on a rough basis in terms of the issues that they might face on a regular basis when using their web archives. Would they consider those issues to be more on the capture side or more on the replay side? And as you can kind of see from the pie chart here, over 42% reported a roughly even distribution, which is the yellow segment. And then when it came to people who provided specific answers, we had about a 2-to-1 ratio of reported capture issues compared to reported replay. So this perhaps suggests that on average the community are reporting that they're facing more issues on the capture side of things. But it's interesting to see how prevalent replay has become, particularly when we think about how dynamic sites have become, because really when we talk about replay issues, it does tend to be the more complex sites that really start to generate these sorts of problems. The second pie chart here, we have inquired about the frequency of communications that an archivist or librarian might have with site owners that they might work with. And about 86.5% of respondents reported that at least sometimes they had communication with site owners, which is fantastic because it kind of proves perhaps that these lines of communications do already exist. And I think the question really at this point is how effectively are we harnessing these lines of communication? Next slide, please. So in the next section of the survey, we asked some fairly open-ended questions to the respondents on what aspects of archivability would they really like to learn more about. And we ran some semantic analysis over the free text answers that were provided by the community members and generated this semantic network diagram. For those who aren't familiar with the semantic network diagram, the idea being that the size of a cluster represents how frequently a word might have appeared, how closely things are clustered together suggests how frequently they're associated, and the lines between them represent individual links between those particular phrases. So you can kind of see towards the center we have a big cluster in the middle, and you can maybe just about make out the terms capture and replay kind of at the core of them. This core cluster, the terms within it, all kind of have a key theme. We see words like dynamic content, embed, functionality, interactive, and kind of the key theme that I draw between the phrases that are being used here is that these are all challenges that require technical knowledge and understanding of how websites are built and are kind of critical to understanding how we might be able to go about archiving these sorts of sites. If we compare that to some of the phrases that are used kind of in the periphery of the diagram, we see on these scattered nodes words like blocks, access, scoping. And this, to me at least, suggests that because these terms are kind of less intertwined and interlinked with more centralized nodes that we're seeing here, perhaps the community already has a relatively good understanding of these sorts of challenges. Perhaps this is really one of the strengths that the community's been able to build over the years. So, next slide, please. So kind of, yeah, some key takeaways. Oh, apologies for the formatting. So I kind of wanted to summarize the findings of the report by kind of highlighting two key quotes that were given by some of the respondents. So the first quote here I have talks about that a lack of training or good resources to help beginners understand what they're doing when archiving websites is a particular problem. And to me, this really is a suggestion that there's perhaps a barrier to entry when it comes to understanding web archivability. And particularly for those who might work in smaller organizations, or perhaps it's a small facet of a wider, branch of preservation that they might do, that this is a real challenge for them because the community resources that exist don't always provide the level of detail and technical knowledge in an accessible manner for those sorts of individuals. And this is kind of reinforced by the second quote here, which talks about only through extensive experience is an individual able to assess a website's archivability. But when something does go wrong, they don't always understand the technical reasons, and therefore they have a hard time explaining that to the web creator or the site owner. And really that, for me, summarizes the entire kind of outcome of this survey, is that we need to be able to try and help bridge that gap between site owners and between librarians and archivists by continuing to build upon existing community resources, particularly on the technical challenges, both on the capture and on the replay side of web archivability.
Excellent.
Thank you very much.
This is the chair, I promise. All right. So we purposefully left a lot of time for discussion, right? Because as you probably noticed throughout these three presentations, even our rockstar panel has many more questions than answers. So let's ask those questions, I guess is a good way of putting this, right? I have a ton. I'm sure you have a ton for each other. I'm sure you have a ton. So because it's about you, not us, please, you guys go ahead and start it off. And we don't have microphones, so just, I don't know, just yell. or have someone yell on your behalf.
That's for Meghan. I noticed you have the archiveready.com site is one of the resources, and people are saying that I'm quite aware of it. It runs the copyright up to 2017. And I just wonder if anybody perhaps here has been in touch with the website at Alamos, because it's super useful. I'd like it to continue to exist. Because it is probably the simplest way to
Yeah, I think it's definitely one of those like digital library projects that seems to be in danger of extinction, that was maybe based on like a research project. And no, I don't know this person. Does anybody know who runs it?
So, Meghan is my colleague at the Internet Archive, and I can talk to him if there is any specific issue you're talking about.
Really just reading the longevity of his website. Is he continuing? I mean,
it's still running, right? I mean,
it's still running.
I will ask him if the source code is open. If can someone else deploy it on their own servers? That would be one way to actually survive it, right?
Yeah.
I did not check his GitHub repository, but yeah, I think
Well, I'm not sure if it's anymore, but he has been updating those. Yeah, this one is 2017, but I think it's 2017 because it was like a ready project. So it's not that it's like end of life, but it's because nothing has really changed from then to now.
And he maintains Safe Page now and some other services at the WebEx machine. So we have hope that it will continue to run for a while. But I can certainly talk to him about kind of thing.
If you can open it, maybe.
So
Yeah, it's active right now. By the way, there is a similar tool. So this Archive-Ready basically tells how archivable the site is. There were like 3 stages. I think the last presenter showed. And there is one, how nicely it is playing back. There is a tool for that, it's called Memento Damage. Basically, it's the opposite, it tells how damaged the archive copy is.
but Archive Ready is just so easy to use, and you put in the live site. There's a bunch of red numbers that come up, and it's like you don't really even need to know what the problem is. All you need to say is, okay, look at all those red numbers there. And I mean, Memento, I think it's a little bit more of a heavy lift because you need it to use the archive for it.
Memento Damage has similar inspiration when it comes to UI and all. It is mine as well, but the web UI is similar. It generally runs slower because it has to interact with web archives, and web archives are generally not as fast responding as the live sites. So it runs on the archive record.
Oh, it does. Like an internal one?
Anything you
put into it? Cool. I'll put that one on the list. Thank you.
I have a question for Tom. So my name is Melissa. I'm from the Library of Congress, but I don't work with Meghan. I'm in the music division, so I do more of the content selection and web collection curation. And something I've encountered is when I have extensive communication with website creators, sometimes instead of it making a website more archivable, it actually, the very act of being in contact with the creators artificially tweaks the content in a way that may not be desirable. For example, there was a dance company that was going out of business, and we were in touch with them as they were doing their shutdown operations. So we were gathering their records, we were crawling their website very quickly, and they put this stupid banner on their website that said proudly archived at the Library of Congress. So it's in our captures. And so I'm wondering, since you're the one on the panel who has mentioned being in touch with various government agencies and departments, if you've had any kind of encounters like that, or if the very fact that this is record schedule related rather than special collections related just negates that entirely. So I'd love to hear more about what you've seen and the outcomes of your crawls when you've had contact with creators.
It's a really good question. I suppose there's a couple of thoughts really. So one example, it's not a specific example, but in general, I suppose it depends what we're really aiming to do when we're web archiving. And sometimes sometimes our guidance historically has said provide an alternative for let's say accessing a data set. Yeah, so you might say, well, okay, you can have an embedded app that allows you to drill down into the data and produce lots of pretty graphs, but also provide a CSV that can just download as a static link or something like that, which is fairly uncontroversial. So that kind of thing has happened. I suppose to be strictly archival about it, if you like, there's I can't think of an example that's just quite like yours, but that tends to be at the point in the life of the website where they're thinking of closing it. So we've kind of made an intervention that has changed the website, and therefore it's then all of a sudden different to probably how 99% of people have interacted with it throughout its life. So it's it's good intentions, but if we're talking about capturing a representation of the website that's kind of authentic, there's a question around that. But a really good recent example was around a video streaming problem, where basically the website owner had embedded a YouTube video into the page. I think it was YouTube, and we basically managed to intervene there and say, look, that's not really going to work how you want it to work. Have you considered, doing an HTML5 video? They did. It works perfectly in the archive. So there's a sort of like that kind of intervention hasn't fundamentally changed what they were trying to do. They can still engage with users in the same way. And it's given us the archivable product in the end.
Question about the survey. Is there a difference in the interest from a National Library, for example, and for a museum?
Yeah, that's a good question. So yeah, we did look a little bit into kind of comparisons between different backgrounds of respondents in terms of what answers they gave. I think kind of the most indicative one was when we talked about the familiarity with frameworks and guidelines in the community. Certainly there seemed to be much more prevalence of familiarity among those with librarian and archivist backgrounds compared to, say, people who came from university backgrounds or perhaps identified as IT specialists, that sort of thing. So I definitely say it's not like a universal breakdown when it comes to how familiar the community is with guidelines, and we're only getting a snapshot with this survey, but it seems like it varies based on the background of the individuals involved.
So my question was also more about the quality that the museum want to reach. Maybe the difference between an industry maybe not really on a large scale art.
Yeah, no. Yeah, so we didn't go into a huge amount of detail in terms of what each respondent individually were doing in terms of their archiving programs, but we did ask them for a broad kind of question on what size of collection they ran, and we did get respondents from people from national libraries, so over 100,000 sites a year, down to the very smallest of maybe less than 10 sites a year. And again, there were kind of distinctions in how respondents answered some of the other questions in the survey. So for example, again, kind of the trend seemed to be that the smaller the collection size, the less familiar they were with kind of existing frameworks or with the ideas of breaking down issues into capture and replay. I can't really speak specifically on necessarily if they faced different types of challenges or if they were more interested in having a higher level of fidelity depending on what their organizational background was. But I mean, I think there's certainly inferences that could be speculated from the data on those subjects, yeah.
Yeah, and I think there were a lot more slides with the little breakdowns of the data, but we wanted more time for talking, and so we're hoping to extract bits of this research and kind of summarize them and put them into Signal blog posts in the future.
Please go ahead. So I'm wondering, is there any analysis done on categorical websites, like or websites categorically? Like in a sense, like government websites versus education sites versus social media sites, news sites, and all, like how archivable these different categories are. Because if we realize, like say, public sites are not archivable, there might be a way to approach our lawmakers to mandate it, basically, in a sense, right? For example, accessibility is a very known thing. Like, yeah, there is a push for it, right? I mean, it's a hard problem, but they did it. There is some work around that. And also, thinking along the same lines, will it be helpful for IIPC to put some efforts in, like, say, documenting this work and, say, publishing W3C document or something so that the broader web developer community gets to know about it? And if we go that far, I'm just imagining further and further, we might be able to convince Google Chrome or something to have a kind of archivability assessment in the developer console itself, like they have for accessibility analysis. I think that will make it visible to a lot more people, and well, it will allow them to hide their sites if they want to and not make it archivable, but at the same time, oh yeah, I need to be concerned about this as well, right?
Yeah, I think it's been really hard to categorize types of websites. But there was something in the research that y'all did towards the end of so one of the outputs of the expert services part of this contract was an internal report for the recommending officers to kind of and us as a team who supports them to get a better understanding of what the situation is. And there was a section about the types of websites. And I can't recall the exact types of websites there were, but I remember reading it and thinking like, oh.
Yes.
Yes.
So, well, there's kind of a few avenues to explore on this one, but certainly when it comes to categorizing websites, it's something that, well, I mean, I work in a QA team. It's something we do all the time. You know, being able to categorize how difficult a website is to archive is kind of critical to what we do. And there's no easy answer because, I mean, I'm sure, Tom, you could speak to this as well. Just because one site is a government site doesn't mean it's going to be any more or less archivable than the next one, even if it's from the same, team that's built the same sites. But to talk on what Meghan was talking about there, so part of the kind of feedback that we gave in this report was understanding that there's a bit of a spectrum between kind of static HTML-based sites and much more dynamic kind of single-page applications, that sort of thing, and kind of there isn't necessarily a trend between your site's more static, that makes it more archivable. That's not necessarily true. It really depends on the implementation in any case. But the more complex it gets, and certainly kind of what we found was sites that kind of sit in the middle of that spectrum, which we use the term hybrid apps for, they really can generate quite a lot of problems because they borrow aspects from both and try and mesh them together. And so, for example, it might be to do with how the navigation is built within the site, that you might be making requests to links on a page, but there's no HTTP requests being made. It's all kind of through hydrated JavaScript, I believe, is the term my colleague used.
There was something like non-deterministic
interactions. Oh, you want to use my key phrase.
Mathematics term? No.
Non-deterministic interactions, to summarize that briefly, is the idea that if you have a web page that's static, a crawler can go through and see that it's all data in the HTML and all the requests are made via HTTP. But if any of the content on the page requires some level of human interaction, so for example that might be a click, it might be a scroll, those requests are usually made kind of after the fact, right? And the crawler can't expect those requests to be made and isn't going to sit around and assume that these requests are going to be made because it's a bot, right? So when it comes to sites that are built with lots of these interactive elements that are dependent on some sort of user input, it makes them inherently a lot less archivable unless you're willing to do lots and lots of interventions, like during crawl time, to capture those requests kind of that don't generate on page load.
And then thinking about what Salwood's suggestion or question was about, like, what would we as a community then suggest to the government, the U.S. government in this case, to regulate single-page applications?
Yeah.
I don't know. What would we say? Like, how do we frame that? I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, we can definitely kind of give recommendations on things like, and another of the pet phrases that myself and my colleagues like to use, the idea of purpose-driven architecture, where use the tools in web development for their intended use, which sounds simplistic, but the idea being that if the content that you're fetching, you're making it via an HTTP post request, does it really need to be a post request, or could that have been a GET request? You know, those are much more easy to archive using web crawling technology. So there are kind of recommendations that we could give building upon existing guidelines, and they're not always going to apply in every circumstance, because there is always a use case for these techniques. But certainly we can kind of improve the conversations on them and kind of help developers understand why these techniques might make things less archivable.
There are historical reasons for that GET posting, right? Of course, those methods are abused, but in the past, what happened was like there was like a limit how large your URL can be, like 256 characters or something like that, right? So if you had a form to submit and you had like content that was in text area, and you submit that, the URL will kind of overflow the size, and they will send it post request, because GET didn't define any payload that can go for that. And I think there was a recent effort on introducing another HTTP method that is like GET-like thing, but it has a defined body, so you can send a body, not in the URL, but as like a payload. They were changing the name of the methods a few times. I don't know what situation it is. It is like an IETF RFC draft at this stage. The last time we checked this.
To say on that point, I think in our space, we see quite a lot of legacy apps using old technologies, and they're kind of like they're almost the ones we want to focus on, in a sense, because they tend to be harder to archive because for these technical reasons. They're coming to the end of life. They may be many cases should have been decommissioned years ago, or migrated to something more accessible, or at least that had some longevity. And the fact that we can talk to the people who manage them, well, they'll, often what comes back is, well, we really can't afford, basically, we can't afford to do anything with it. It's basically working for most of our users. So we're going to, in future, we'll do something much better. But for now, this is what we've got. So there's that kind of thing. But I just say, I think your idea of using W3C, some sort of centralized body, if you like, I think is a really good idea for this kind of program.
Or what about I don't know, like a state of the technology report? But sorry, go ahead.
Sorry, Ilya and Tobias.
Oh, okay.
Sorry.
Yes, I've definitely been thinking a lot about this topic, and I think there's definitely more that can be done with tooling. I think Archive Ready is a great first step, but it could be one idea that I've had that I don't have time to implement is a browser extension that someone could turn on, and then as you're browsing, it will evaluate the network traffic of the site and produce kind of a live report of how archivable that site is, and it could determine sort of how dynamic it is, how much non-determinism there is on the page, and then it could actually tell you sort of what the issue is on the page. I don't have time to build it myself, but just putting it out there that would be a way to produce kind of an accurate estimate of what makes a site archivable or not, because it's not trivial just by looking at a page to see how dynamic or not dynamic it is.
You're actually moving the QA process a little bit closer towards capture, away from replay, right? Because that has its own issues. But if you can get closer to the capture process, potentially that your life is
so let's say you want to archive a particular page, you turn on the browser extension, you interact with the page, you do the things that you need to do on it, and then you press stop, and it gives you a report of how easy is it to archive that. And there's all sorts of things that could be done. There's all sorts of data that could be collected that could provide useful information about how archivable it is, what's not archivable on that page, if it has dynamic elements, if you click on things that a crawler might miss, and so forth. So there's ample opportunity to build.
And you can actually give it to the web developer, so they can actually test it before.
Yes.
We even get to capturing it.
Yeah. So
they can fix it.
If IPC wants to support something like this,
Tobias?
Yeah, I would follow up on this because I think it's maybe not only about giving a report about archivability. It could be also about automatically selecting the right capturing process for the web page. So as browser-based crawlers are obviously better for some web pages or problematic web pages. And if we have some automatic tools to analyze the web page and see these are dynamic content stuff, things that we need browser tricks or another capturing method, then this could be automatically done. And I think that would be practical.
I think, yeah, we've been experimenting with that at scale for the last 3 years.
Yeah, it still feels like an experiment as well, doesn't it?
It does. You want to?
Yeah, we do pre-crawl analysis with using tools like WAPalyzer that have it's a bit like built with. So it's got a list of the technologies that exist on a website, and based on the report that we get by putting a seed URL into that, we can try and determine whether we should be using a browser-based or a text-based crawler.
But it has its advantages and disadvantages in that you're often visually checking, and we both do this, visually checking, and you find, oh no, this actually is wrong. So perhaps like a better WAPalyzer is something that could be good.
Good question for all of you, but everybody actually. I get the impression, but please correct me if I'm wrong, that most cases and examples that you brought up, most cases you've seen is that the lack of archivability is somewhat incidental or accidental. But there is no bad will from the website creator. Have you seen examples or other examples where a website creator said, no, I'm definitely going to do the Google Maps thing to make sure that you can't crawl me. the exclusion thing by making things crazy. Is that a thing? Not yet? Facebook?
Yeah, so Facebook, more social media.
Right, yeah, sure. But, I'm thinking more innocently in the legal deposit domain, government websites and things like that.
Oh, sure. Well, Cloudflare came up because that's picking up even more and more, or well, similar.
So that could be a proxy then. Is the Cloudflare client using Cloudflare in order to keep bots out, right? Maybe that's the question.
But we are also bots, and that was as like bad bots and good bots. Because right now, I think even just archiving bots could be considered bad bots because, well, AI can make stuff from archiving, and there you go.
Right.
There's also logging. You need, I think, sorry, you need to register the bot and open the service, and all the slides videos, all the commands and the send post. So those two button button need to register. So to preserve it by using your tricks, for example. And they didn't do it because it's private, because they don't want forthcoming paid commands, things like that.
So I liked Ilya's nomenclature he wants to introduce. I don't know where to say on that one. There was like 3 or 4 different levels of classification of websites when it comes to archivability. It kind of sounded more like Noam Chomsky's language classification, like it's like regular language versus context-sensitive language. There was concern about the interactivity on the page, like somebody's source might be loaded or something might change when you have like hover over or scroll or do things like that. I think it is possible to have like a thorough analysis, like when kind of loading the JavaScript and checking all the registered event handlers and stuff like that, and analyzing some of the CSS stuff, like what it is triggering, and create like a map of like all the possible interactions that are there on a page, and kind of not doing on every page, but some pages on a website, and then building something like a memento tracer or what Ilya calls behaviors or something. Those things can be built on top of that, and then that is applied on pages from that site. Like and after some work, maybe there is like a you can analyze some of these interactions and not making any newer HTTP requests, and also maybe those can be excluded to slim down. I mean, what I'm saying is like technically it's perhaps possible to get there to kind of also things like different DPIs will cause different SRP set, like images with different quality will be loaded. Generally, you load whatever browser you are using, whatever settings you have. So figuring those things out is also kind of possible.
Any?
I like, much as I like the idea of beating web developers with the stick of regulation. Is there also a carrot that you found? Because you've been, and lots of people in this room have been talking to people that run websites. Can we also sell it, not just as archivability, but this will help? Is capturing that as a sales pitch? Can we? So integrating with regulation and tools one way is to say this will make your site better. Can we get it into, the lighthouse frameworks that are used to evaluate speed, that kind of thing? Is there a point there in the panel's opinion that would be a good leverage point?
Seal of something.
Yeah. Well, it's something that I was just thinking the same thing, and also coming up with an annual list of the 10 sites that are most archivable.
That is a brilliant carrot. I love that.
I was like, hey, you got on the list.
I like that.
What I was going to say to that is something. I'm from the University of Kentucky, and luckily we've been having a partnership with our web development team. We've been talking to them about accessibility in terms of archiving and like changing that phrasing to web content creators from archivability to accessibility. How long do you want your website to be accessible for? Because most people, particularly web content creators, they still don't have the understanding that their website might not last forever, and they care less about archiving than they do accessibility.
Yes.
So changing the semantics of it to an access issue seems to be something that we think is
It sounds like a perfect success story to highlight through the IIPC, honestly, right?
And just thinking about all of the reasons governmentally and legally we wouldn't be able to put out a top 10 list of most accessible websites. Are you saying my website is not accessible? Wouldn't it?
Yeah, there's also the point I think about how, like in general, like the accessibility point, and that, like, what does having an archivable site facilitate? Like, so we have quite a lot of websites that basically have old content that serves, like, let's say, one user a month downloads a particular report from it. It's like, the end of the long tail. If you can say to people, well, look, we're going to be around. We're a web archive. We're going to be around. Make your archive accessible. We'll harvest it, and you can redirect to us. That's one of the things that we do, and that helps a lot, I think.
So I hate to do this, and I really do, but it's fun to see that there are still more questions than answers, so that's good. But I think we made a little bit of progress today. It was certainly entertaining. In the interest of time, because we are at time, we only have a 10-minute break until the lightning talk, session starts. So please join me in thanking our all-star panel.